The promise had been signed in her father's library on a Tuesday, between the soup and the meat, and Cordelia Hartwell had not been admitted to the room. She heard of it from Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, who delivered the news the way she delivered cold tea, with apology already in the curve of her shoulders.
Lord Felix Ashbourne, my lady, by midsummer.
Cordelia's hand, which had been turning the brass key over and over between her fingers since breakfast, closed around it once and then went still. The key was her brother's. The brother had been 3 years gone. The midsummer was 11 weeks away. She set the key down on the writing table beside the unfinished horse-trotting sketch, and she crossed the long indigo carpet to the window. Outside, the lilacs were doing what lilacs did in May. The bees were doing what bees did. The world had the criminal indifference of things not yet told. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let it cool the rising temper. There was a way out. There had to be. She did not yet know what shape it would take or who would speak it aloud, but she set her thumb against the window pane and traced one slow line down the cold and made herself a private contract. She would not walk to the altar in midsummer with Lord Felix Ashbourne's signet on her hand. The how of it she would build between now and then. She turned back to the writing table and did the small, useful thing she always did when fear arrived. She made a list. 3 names. Her Aunt Lavinia in Bath, who had married for love against a marquis's father. Mrs. Chesterton, the headmistress of the school in Berkshire she had attended at 13. And the Duke of Vexley, whose estate marched alongside Marbury at the river, who had been Edward's friend at Eton and who had brought home Edward's signet ring in his own hand after the fever in Calais, and who, 3 years ago, had stood in this very room with his hat in his hands and said, quietly, "If there is ever anything." Then there had been nothing for 3 years, because there had been nothing for anyone to give. She set the list down. She wrote, against her own better judgment, the Duke of Vexley's name 3rd. Then she crossed it out. Then she wrote it again at the top. Her father came in at 4. He had aged 8 years since Christmas, when the letter from the Marquis of Renshaw had arrived, containing a civilized accounting of promissory notes against the Marbury estate that her grandfather had signed in a Brighton card room 41 years ago, and that the Marquis had been collecting at 5% compounded interest. The accounting came to £14,000. Marbury held, in liquid funds, 6. The Marquis had a younger son not yet placed. The arithmetic had presented itself with the cold elegance of a chess problem already solved. Cordelia. Her father's voice had developed the careful, padded quality of a man walking on glass he himself had broken. Lord Felix has sent a note. He is coming down on Saturday. Yes. You will go. Yes. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and for one terrible private moment, she saw exactly how much he hated the word he had spoken. She crossed to him and laid her hand on his sleeve. He had been in the South Garden, where he went these days because it had no ledger in it. Papa, she said, I will manage Saturday. I would not ask it of you. You are not asking. I am offering. There is a difference. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve. The Marbury topaz sat on her middle finger, where her mother had put it the night before her mother had been taken from them. And he looked at it the way other men looked at things they had once been able to protect. He covered her hand with his own and held it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, He is not a kind man, Cordelia. I know. He is a man who has read a great many books about kindness. I know that also. Then you know what is being asked of you. I do. He closed his eyes, nodded once, and walked back into the corridor. She heard his boots all the way to the library and the soft closing of the door, and she stood alone for a count of 40 before she went back to the writing table and finished the 3rd name on her list in a clean, deliberate hand. His Grace, the Duke of Vexley. Saturday smelled of horse and beeswax, and Cordelia stood at the front step of Marbury Hall in an indigo carriage dress altered twice in a fortnight to fit the 8 pounds she had lost to nerves, and she watched the matched bays of Lord Felix Ashburn's curricle come up the drive at exactly 2 o'clock. Lord Felix was punctual. Lord Felix was, in every visible particular, exquisite. He stepped down in a dove-grey driving coat, ice-blue waistcoat, snow-white linen. His hair was the colour of new wheat, and his eyes the cold blue of sky between cloud banks just before the weather turns. He smiled at her, with the practised smile of a man who had been told from boyhood that his smile was the chief part of his fortune, and he kissed her hand without looking at her face, which she found, even at that early hour, deeply instructive. "Lady Cordelia, you will forgive my eagerness. I could not bear to leave the matter until next week." "I am glad you have come, my lord." The lie sat on her tongue like a coin she would have to spit out later. He handed her up into the curricle and arranged the rug over her knees, and as he gathered the reins, he glanced down at her left hand. "You are not wearing my ring." "Your father has sent only the letter, my lord. He has not sent any ring." "I gave instruction that the ring should arrive with the letter." "It did not." He clicked his tongue. The bays sprang forward. He drove with the easy economy of a man who had been driving since 9, and he took the river road at a measured trot, and did not slow at the gate where the steward stood holding it open, and he did not nod to the steward as they passed. Cordelia, who had known Mr. Banbury since she was 4, lifted her gloved hand and nodded to him over Lord Felix's wrist, and Mr. Banbury bowed back to her with the deepest courtesy of his 30 years on the estate, and she felt the small, precise warmth of it under her left collarbone. "You will need to learn," Lord Felix said pleasantly, as they came out onto the open river road, "not to acknowledge the servants quite so warmly when you are in my company. It puts them above themselves." "Mr. Banbury was my father's steward when I was 4. "And he will continue to be your father's steward when you are no longer in your father's house. The two facts are not connected." He said it in the same tone he had used on the lilacs. She turned her face to the river, so he should not see the colour rise on her throat. A heron stood in the shallows at the bend, perfectly still. She set her thumb against the topaz on her middle finger and made herself a second private contract. She would not let this man near Mr. Banbury, ever, in any circumstance. The how of that one also she would build between now and then. They drove for an hour. He spoke of his stables, his hounds, his late mother's tiara. 9 principal stones, valued at 3,000 guineas in 1812, kept in the strong room at Renshaw, and never to be removed without her husband's written permission. She listened. She made the small, pleasant murmurs a woman makes when she is taking notes. At the milestone, he reined the bays in and looked at her at last, the way a man looks at a horse he has bought and is now inspecting for hidden lameness. "You are not pretty in the conventional way." "My lord?" "It is not a complaint. The conventional way is dull. Your colouring is unusual. The auburn is very nearly red, which is not the fashion, and your mouth is wider than it should be, and you have a habit of looking at people as though you were measuring them for something. These are not faults. In a wife, they are inconveniences only. I tell you in advance, so that there will be no surprises between us." "I am grateful, my lord, for the advance notice." He smiled. He did not catch the iron in it. He turned the bays for home. The heron had caught its silver fish at last, and Cordelia watched it disappear down the long S of the heron's throat. And she thought, clearly and without heat, "I will not marry this man." They came into Marbury Court at 4. The Duke of Vexley's grey gelding was tied to the ring at the mounting block. She could not at first make sense of it. The Duke had not been to Marbury Hall in 3 years. He wrote a Christmas note each December and sent a brace of partridges at Michaelmas, and otherwise kept to his own side of the river. The grey gelding at the mounting block ran a clean shock down her spine. It meant he had ridden the 7 miles alone, that he had come in at the front and not the back, and that he had wanted his arrival visible to anyone on the drive. Lord Felix said, "Whose horse is that?" "The Duke of Vexley's." "You are acquainted with the Duke of Vexley?" He was my brother's particular friend at Eton. He brought my brother's ring home from Calais. He has been our neighbour since I was 8. Indeed. Lord Felix handed the reins to the groom and offered her his arm without looking at the grey gelding again. She took the arm. The alternative was the small public scene of refusing it on her own carriage step, and she walked up the steps of Marbury Hall, and she felt, the way one feels rain on the back of the neck, the gaze of someone watching them from the library window. Pemberton, butler at Marbury since before she was born, opened the door at exactly the right second. He bowed to Lord Felix. He bowed slightly more deeply to her, which she registered and decided to think about later. His Grace the Duke of Vexley is in the green drawing-room with the Earl, my lady. He's been here 20 minutes. He brought a book the Earl had asked after at Christmas. He has refused refreshment. It was, for Pemberton, a great quantity of speech. She glanced at him. He met her eye with the calm of a man conveying, in the only manner permitted to him, that the cavalry had arrived from the next county. Thank you, Pemberton. I shall go in. Will you take tea, Lord Felix? Pemberton inquired with grave neutrality. I shall pay my respects to the Duke first. Of course, my lord. This way. The green drawing-room had been her mother's favourite. North light, walls the pale green of new beech leaves, heavy indigo silk curtains. The fire was low, the windows open. The Duke stood at the long window with his back to the room when she came in, and her father, in the wing chair by the fire, was looking at his back with the first unguarded expression she had seen on his face in 5 months. The Duke turned at the sound of the door. He had not changed in 3 years, and he had changed entirely. The shoulders were the same. The dark hair was the same, cut short, no fashion about it. The grey eyes were the same, grave, still grey, she remembered. But there was a weather across his face now, a settled quality, the look of a man who had been holding the weight of his title long enough that it no longer surprised him in the morning. He stood in her mother's green drawing-room, with his hat in his hands, the way he had stood 3 years ago, with a different burden, and he looked at her over Lord Felix's shoulder, and for that first moment, he held the silence between them. She named his title, crossed the room, and gave him her hand. He bowed over it. Lady Cordelia, he said. His voice was lower than she remembered. The fingers under her glove were warm. He held her hand 1 second longer than the introduction required, then released it, and turned to Lord Felix with the blank courtesy of a duke greeting a younger son of a marquis. Lord Felix, he said. He had not known he was of the party. He begged forgiveness of his intrusion and would not stay above a quarter of an hour. He was no intrusion, her father said. He had not risen from the wing chair. The afternoon had turned cool, Lord Felix said pleasantly. He would not have her chilled. How considerate, said the Duke, in a tone in which the consideration was not primarily what was being remarked upon. He turned back to her father. He had brought the Coke. Her father's edition was damaged at Christmas, he recalled. This was a clean copy. His grandfather's. It was hers. Vexley, her father began. He could not. It was his to give, the Duke said. He had read it twice. He had no further use for it. He set the book down on the marquetry table. It was bound in dark green leather, and her father, who had not asked for the book in 2 years, looked at it, and then at the Duke, and his eyes filled, quickly, before he could stop them. The Duke turned slightly toward the window, so as not to be seen seeing it, and Cordelia, watching them both, understood for the first time clearly that the Duke had not come on a Saturday afternoon to bring a law book. He would not keep them, the Duke said gently. He would ride home now and let them have their tea in peace. He bowed and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and turned, as a man turns when he has remembered a small additional matter, and said easily that Lady Cordelia would not have heard. The chapel at Vexley had been re-roofed. The masons had finished on Thursday. Her brother's window was back in. If she should like to come and see it any morning this week, her father's carriage would be welcome at any hour. She held her gaze steady on the Duke for one full breath before turning.
"That was kind, Your Grace," she said. She would come.
Thursday morning, perhaps, he said. The light was best in the chapel before noon.
"Thursday morning,"
she said. He bowed once more and went out. Pemberton closed the door behind him. They heard, through the open window, his boot in the stirrup and the grey gelding's hoofs on the gravel. And Lord Felix stood at the centre of the green drawing-room, with his hands clasped behind his back. And he said pleasantly, "Your father's house is more populous on a Saturday than I had been led to expect, Lady Cordelia." "His Grace was their nearest neighbour, my lord," she answered. "And the window at the chapel at Vexley," Lord Felix observed.
"Her brother's memorial window," she said. "It had been put in 3 years ago by the Duke. It had been damaged in the December gales. She had not heard it was back in, and she should like to see it."
"With his permission, naturally," Lord Felix said. She turned to him slowly. Her father did not move. The clock on the mantel struck the 4:15.
"My lord, we are not yet married. I shall visit the chapel at Vexley on Thursday morning. I shall take Mrs. Bell with me, who has nursed me since I was an infant, and will provide a chaperonage at which the bishop himself could not complain. I shall be home before luncheon. I shall, on subsequent Thursdays, observe whatever propriety you wish to lay down for me. On this Thursday, I am still my father's daughter, and the visit was offered to my father's daughter, and I shall accept it as such." The silence after this was perfect and brief. Her father set his hand carefully on the arm of the chair, the way a man steadies himself who has just felt the floor lift. Lord Felix's pleasant smile did not change. His ice-blue eyes adjusted, fractionally, the way a hawk's adjust on a hare in long grass, and he inclined his head with the courtesy of a man who has just received intelligence on which he will act later. "Of course, Lady Cordelia. As you say, you are not yet married." He stayed 20 minutes longer. He took tea. He asked her father a series of small, polite, surgical questions about the Marbury rents in the Western farms, and her father answered with the courtesy of a man parrying knives. And at 5 o'clock, Lord Felix kissed her hand a second time, without looking at her face, and went out to his curricle. Cordelia stood at the window beside her father and watched the curricle out of sight, and neither of them spoke. Her father said her name at last. She answered. He observed that Vexley had not ridden 7 miles on a Saturday to bring a law book, and she said no. He told her she should go on Thursday, and she said she would. He picked up the green leather coke from the marquetry table, weighed it in his hand the way a man weighs a coin for soundness, and set it down again. He said quietly into the green drawing-room, "I do not, regarding Lord Felix Ashburn, have any leverage at all, Cordelia. The note will come due. If we do not produce a wedding, we will produce a public sale, and I shall go and live with your aunt in Bath, and we shall have nothing. That is the state of the case. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I told you on a Tuesday between the soup and the meat because I am a coward. I have not slept since Christmas. You may have noticed." "I noticed, Papa." Her father attempted twice to ask whether there was anything in what Vexley had not quite said, and she told him she did not yet know. She would come back from Thursday and tell him. He nodded and let the question rest. He sat down in the wing chair by the fire. He looked old, as he had since Christmas, but the tiredness in him now was not despair, but something more useful. The tiredness of a man who has just heard, far off, the first horn of a hunt, and who does not know yet whether it comes for him or for his enemies, but has been told, at last, that there is a hunt. She crossed to him. She kissed his forehead. The skin was cold. She went up to her own room and shut the door, and she sat down on the edge of the bed without taking off her bonnet or her gloves. She thought, for a long stretch, only about a green drawing-room and a green leather book and a grey gelding tied at the mounting block at 4 o'clock. Then, after 40 steady breaths, she allowed herself to think about the Duke's face when he had said, "If you should like to come and see it any morning this week,
how he had not looked at Lord Felix when he said it. And she allowed herself one small, private sentence. He came over the river. Thursday came in cool and bright, with the south wind moving the chestnuts, and Cordelia, with Mrs. Bell beside her in the brougham and the brass key on a black cord tucked inside her bodice, watched the iron pillars of Vexley come up at 9:30. The avenue was a mile long, the chestnuts in full leaf, the dappled green light over the gravel the colour of pond water in May. Mrs. Bell explained, as if it were not the third time that morning, that His Grace's housekeeper was Mrs. Quill, formerly Mrs. Bell's second cousin's wife. Cordelia, who had been told all of this on Tuesday and again at breakfast, said she knew. The brougham came round the last curve, and Vexley came into view. A long, low, pale stone house from the reign of the second Charles, 3 stories high, with a fanlight over the door the size of a small carriage wheel, chestnuts almost to the south front windows, the wisteria over the porch, a single violet drift. Mrs.
Quill stood on the top step in a black gown with a ring of keys at her waist, and she dipped her knee to Cordelia as the brougham stopped.
Lady Cordelia, His Grace begs you will come straight to the chapel. The light is at its best until 11. He has gone ahead to open the south door. Thank you, Mrs. Quill. Mrs. Bell, the cook has set out hot chocolate in the small parlour. You will be more comfortable there until her ladyship returns from the chapel. Mrs. Bell, who had received her instructions before they entered the carriage, and who had no intention of putting one foot between Cordelia and the Duke in the chapel of his own estate, climbed down with the patient dignity of a 60-year-old woman who had been carrying secrets professionally since 1782, and she walked into the south hall on Mrs. Quill's arm without looking back. The small parlour door closed behind them, and Cordelia was, for the first time since Saturday, alone in the open air with the chapel, a separate stone building, smaller, half hidden by yew, in front of her. She walked. The south door of the chapel stood half open, and the smell from it was of cold stone and beeswax and lime mortar still drying after the new roof. She stepped over the threshold and stood for a moment in the half-dark. The Duke was at the far end of the chapel, beside the new window with his back to her. He had taken off his coat and laid it across the front pew, and the white linen of his shirt across the breadth of his shoulders, and the way the new window threw the green of Edward's name across the back of his head, stopped her in the doorway for 3 counts before she could trust her face. She named his title. He turned at once. He had not heard her boot on the threshold, and the surprise on his face was not the surprise of a man who had not known she was coming. It was the surprise of a man who had known she was coming and had not, until the door opened, quite let himself believe that she would. Lady Cordelia, he said. She had come. She had said she should. Yes, he said. She had. He picked up his coat and shrugged it on swiftly, and he came down the chapel toward her with his hand out. She gave him hers. He held it for the same second longer than strictly necessary, and released it. They walked the length of the chapel together over the cold flagstones in step, and at the end he stopped, and he let the window do the speaking for 1 full, clean minute before he said anything at all. The window was Edward. Not a portrait, not a recognizable face, but Edward in the way windows can be people. The light through the green of the lower half and the gold of the upper made a shape that was not a body, but was the place in the air where his body had stood, the long, lean shape of him at 15, with a rod in his hand, on the bank of the river behind Marbury. The green was the green of that river. The gold was an August afternoon in 1815, when he had caught a 4-pound trout, and would not let her hold it because she was, he had said gravely, 12. The window had been put in 3 years ago, damaged in the December gales, and was back in. The light came down through the gold of an August afternoon she had not seen, and would not see, and her eyes filled, and she had to take one slow breath before she trusted herself with words. She thanked him at last for putting it back. It was only the lead, he said. The glass had been sound. The masons had done the rest. He had written her from Calais, she said, on the night they lost her brother. Yes. He had not, in 3 years,
told her what was in Edward's last letter to him. The Duke took his time before answering. Outside, the south wind moved a chestnut leaf against the lead of a south casement and made a tiny scraping. He set his hand on the back of the front pew, the way a man sets his hand on a horse he has owned all his life. Edward had written him about her, he said quietly. A great deal about her. He had written that she read agricultural pamphlets in the library at midnight by the kitchen fire, and that she had told him at Easter that if she were a boy, she would have studied for a clerkship at Lincoln's Inn, because she had a useful head for figures and a strong appetite for grievance. Edward had written that if the Duke should ever find himself able to assist his sister in anything substantive, he begged him to consider that he had inherited the obligation along with the signet. He had written it in a hand that by the 7th sentence had stopped shaking, although it had shaken at the first. The chapel held the words and gave them back. She felt them land. She set her gloved hand on the back of the same pew, 3 feet from his. She observed that he had been keeping the letter for 3 years, and he said yes. She observed that in those 3 years he had said nothing of it. He answered that nothing in the 3 years had required it of him. She said, "There is now." He said, "Yes." She turned to him. He turned to her. The new window threw the green of the river across his face and the gold of August across his throat, and his grey eyes met hers with the calm, grave attention of a man who had ridden 7 miles to make this minute possible, and had no intention of wasting it. She told him that on Saturday he had said something in her father's drawing room she had been thinking about since, and he agreed. He had not said it openly, she went on. He had said it under the cover of a chapel window and a coke. Her father had understood him. She had understood him. Lord Felix had understood him, which she believed was also intended. He said it was. She asked him to say it openly now. He let go of the back of the pew. He turned to face her fully. He stood 3 feet from her, in the cold north light of her brother's chapel, and he put his hands behind his back, in the parade rest of a man who needed to keep his hands occupied with something other than the small, private thing they wished to do. And he said, "Lady Cordelia, 11 weeks before Christmas, the late Marquis of Renshaw, Lord Felix's father, collected, through a London solicitor of indifferent reputation, the original signed promissory notes against the Marbury estate that your grandfather signed at the Brighton card room in 1785. The notes amount to £14,000 with interest. Your father owes him this money. Your father does not have this money. The Marquis of Renshaw has therefore offered, in lieu, the marriage of his younger son to Lady Cordelia Hartwell. The arithmetic is intended to be inescapable. Am I correct in any particular?" "In every particular," she said. Then he should tell her the following. On Tuesday last, he had purchased the original notes from the Marquis of Renshaw's solicitor. The chapel and the new window, and the cold stone, and the smell of beeswax and lime mortar, and the sound of the chestnut leaf against the casement all went, for a moment, completely still. Cordelia heard her own pulse in her left ear. She heard it again. She kept her hand fixed on the back of the pew. She began his title, and broke off. He went on as though she had not. The solicitor, he told her, had been replaced for honesty 3 years ago, and had been hungry since. He had paid £14,240 for the original notes. The 240 had been the solicitor's commission. The notes were in the safe in his library, in her grandfather's hand, with the dates and the seals. The Marquis did not yet know. He had been told the notes were misplaced in a move of office furniture and would be located by the end of the month, at which time he would be informed they had been sold, in lieu of unpaid solicitor's fees, to an anonymous third party. In time, the inquiries would lead to Vexley. By then, her father would already have the notes, which the Duke would hand him in person on Saturday morning. Her father might do with them whatever he wished, the Duke went on. Burn them, frame them, light his pipe with them. From Saturday morning at 10, they were no longer enforceable against Marbury, because alongside the notes he would place in her father's hand a deed of release in his own hand, witnessed by his steward
and the Vexley solicitor, releasing the Earl from any obligation whatsoever to him arising out of the notes. He would ask nothing in return. Not the repayment of the 14,000, not interest, not future repayment when the Marbury timber came in, not any obligation of any kind in any future year. The matter, regarding the £14,000, would simply be over. She had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of the third sentence. She made herself draw a breath. The chapel air was cold against the back of her throat. She began his title again, and again he did not let her finish. There was more, he said. He told her this because she must understand that the offer of Saturday morning was unconditional. He did not buy the notes to buy her. He did not lift the obligation from her father to set a different one on her. If, on Saturday afternoon, she chose to marry Lord Felix anyway, for any reason at all, that decision would remain entirely hers, and he would ride home to Vexley, and they would continue to be the neighbours they had been for 17 years, with no further consequence to her or to her family. The notes went to her father whether or not she married him. The notes went to her father whether or not she married anyone. Marry, she said, him. That, he said, was the second thing he had to say. He stood still in the green and gold light of her brother's window. He had not moved his hands from behind his back. He had not stepped any closer to her than the 3 feet he had taken when he had turned to face her, and the 3 feet held between them the way a river holds between 2 banks. Lady Cordelia, he said evenly. He did not propose to her today. Today was for the notes only. He would propose to her on Saturday afternoon, in her father's library, in her father's presence, an hour after the notes were in her father's hand and she had had her hour to read the deed of release for herself. He would propose, having first cleared, with his own money, the obligation that made her present engagement unrefusable. He chose this method because he did not wish to propose to a woman who could not refuse him. He did not wish to propose with leverage in his pocket. He did not wish her to accept him and to discover, 3 years from now, in some quiet moment by her own fire, that she had accepted him because there had been no other way out of Lord Felix's curricle. So the notes went to her father first, with no condition. The proposal came after. And Saturday afternoon, with the engagement to Lord Felix legally undone, she might refuse him, knowing that she had lost nothing by refusing, that Marbury was hers and her father's, and that he would ride home over the river without one further consequence to her house. That was the offer. She heard the chestnut leaf against the casement. She heard her own breath. He was giving her father £14,000, she said. He was giving her father 1 piece of paper, he replied. The paper happened to be worth £14,000. It was not a technical distinction, she said. It was to him. Why? For the first time in the chapel, he was slow to answer. He looked at her with the grave, still grey of his eyes, and he said at last, "Because the alternative is that you walk in midsummer to the altar of a church in London, on the arm of a man who told you in his own curricle that you were not pretty in the conventional way, and in no minute of any day of the 17 years I have known you would I have allowed that to happen if I could find any means to prevent it. The notes were a means. The proposal on Saturday afternoon is a separate matter. The notes ensure that on Saturday you are in a position to give me whatever answer is the true one. That is the whole of it." She had not, in 17 years, heard the Duke speak 15 sentences in a row before. How, she asked, had he known about the curricle? Mrs. Bell, he said, had told Mrs. Quill on Sunday morning, at the back gate over New Asparagus. Mrs. Quill had told his steward at breakfast. His steward had told him at 10. The asparagus, he believed, had been excellent. Mrs. Bell had done her duty by her, Lady Cordelia, as she had been doing since the night her mother was taken. She drew a long breath and let it out, and she set her hand flat against the back of the pew where his hand had been. She set the cases out, one by one, and made him answer each. If she refused him, the notes still went to her father. He said yes. He rode home, and no consequence followed. Yes, and none. And if she accepted him? He did not move. This time he looked nowhere but at her. Then, he said, between Saturday and the license they would arrange whatever she wished. The wedding might be at the chapel here, or at the parish church at Marbury, or at St. George's in London, or any other licensed church, at any hour of any month between June and Christmas. He had no preference. Her father would give her away. Her Aunt Lavinia, he was informed by Mrs. Bell, would be her matron. The settlements would be drawn entirely in her favor by a solicitor of her own choosing. He would pay him. She would instruct him. The solicitor would report to her and to her father, not to him. The pin money would be $3,000 a year, paid quarterly. The London house, when they were in London, would be hers to choose. The country house would be Vexley. The home farm at Vexley he would transfer to her father's management on a peppercorn rent, an occupation and an income separate from Marbury and entirely his own. He made these particulars known now, so that on Saturday she should not have to ask them at the moment of decision. He had prepared a great deal, she said. He had had 37 days, he said. He had been at home 37 days, she said. He had come home from the north, he said, because Mrs. Bell's cousin had written to Mrs. Quill on the day the Renshaw letter arrived at Marbury. The servants of two estates marching at the river had considerably more network than the two estates believed. He had come home, bought the notes, drawn the deed. He had been waiting, with the particulars in his writing desk, for a Tuesday between the soup and the meat to arrive in her father's drawing room. On Saturday morning, when Lord Felix's curricle was seen at Marbury gates, he had sent for the grey gelding and ridden over. He had stood 20 minutes in her father's drawing room and said nothing of this, she observed. It had not been the place. Lord Felix had been in the room, and he did not negotiate the future of a lady in the presence of the man currently engaged to her. The book had been the cover. The announcement had been the instrument. The chapel had been the venue. They were, now, in the chapel. The slow, heavy private truth was that she had, in 17 years of knowing the Duke, never been alone in a room with him before this minute, and had not, until this minute, understood that the cold, polite, grey-eyed neighbour who had brought home her brother's signet in 1823 had been thinking about her, quietly and methodically, for longer than she had imagined. She said his title, and he answered. On Saturday afternoon in her father's library, she said. Yes, he said. She would have her answer. Yes, he said. She would not, this morning, give it to him, and he would not, this morning, ask it of her. Good, she said. Yes, he said. They stood for one more count of 7 beside her brother's window. They walked the length of the chapel together over the cold flagstones in step, and at the south door, he stopped and handed her out into the wisteria sunlight. Mrs. Bell, in the small parlour, set down her cup of cocoa and stood, because she had heard Lady Cordelia's boots on the gravel at the calculated hour. She named Mrs. Bell, and Mrs. Bell answered. She would go home now, she said, and on the way she would not speak. Mrs. Bell would forgive her. Mrs. Bell said, yes, my lady, and yes, my lady, and tucked the rug. The brougham went down the long chestnut avenue at a walking trot, and Cordelia sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and the brass key on its black cord cold against her breastbone. And she watched the dappled green light over the gravel slide past the window, and she thought, privately and carefully, about a deed of release and a peppercorn rent, and a man who had said, with his hands behind his back in the cold chapel, that he had not, in 17 years, intended to let her walk to that altar, if he could find any means to prevent it. She thought also, against her will, about the way the white linen of his shirt had stretched across the breadth of his shoulders when she had come in at the chapel door before he had heard her. She thought about that for rather longer than she had intended to. She made herself stop thinking about it at the lodge gates, because Mr. Banbury was standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, the man Lord Felix had told her she was not, in future, to acknowledge warmly. Mr. Banbury bowed to her as the brougham came through, and she rolled the window down and laid her gloved hand on his shoulder for 3 counts, and said clearly, "Good morning, Mr. Banbury."
I am glad to see you. And he straightened with a slow, careful smile and said, Good morning, Lady Cordelia. I am glad to see you also. And the brougham went on. Mrs. Bell, in the seat opposite, tucked the rug more firmly over Cordelia's knees, with the certain satisfaction of a woman whose strategic Sunday morning conversation over a basket of new asparagus had paid out exactly as she had intended. Saturday morning came in slate grey, with a wet wind off the river, and the chestnuts at the lodge gates were lashing themselves against their own trunks, and at 10 o'clock the Duke of Vexley rode in at the front gate on his grey gelding, a sealed pouch in his saddlebag, and Pemberton, who had been told by Mrs. Bell to stand in the entrance hall at 5 minutes to 10, opened the front door before the Duke had finished tying his horse to the ring at the mounting block. Pemberton spoke his title. The Duke asked after the Earl, and was told the Earl was in the library and had been there since 7. The Duke asked after Lady Cordelia, and was told that she was in the morning room with Mrs. Bell, that she had taken 2 cups of coffee and no breakfast, and that Mrs. Bell wished it conveyed that the second cup was for steadiness and not for nerves, which were not, the housekeeper would have his grace know, in question. The Duke asked that his thanks be carried back to Mrs. Bell. Pemberton, with pleasure, offered to show him to the library. The library, the Duke said. The library was at the southwest corner of the house, and got the slate light of the wet morning through 3 tall windows. The Earl was at the centre window when Pemberton opened the door, and the Duke came in, and the Earl turned, with the brittle alertness of a man who has not slept properly since Christmas, and does not yet know whether the Duke is coming as a friend or as a vulture. The Duke crossed the carpet in 5 strides, and took his hand and held it and said quietly, Marbury, I have brought you something. Sit down. Vexley, sit down. The thing in the saddlebag is good news. You should be sitting when I hand it to you. The Earl sat in the wing chair he had been sitting in for 5 months. The Duke pulled up the footstool from the hearth and sat on it at his feet, the way Edward had used to sit at his father's feet over the chessboard at 12, a fact the Duke had remembered all morning and had decided in advance to use as a posture. He undid the buckle of the saddlebag, took out the sealed pouch, broke the seal with his thumb, and laid the contents one by one on the cherrywood table. A thin sheaf of 3 documents in brown ink and brittle paper that the Earl recognized at once as his father's hand and the Marbury seal of 1785. A second sheaf in fresh black ink on white paper with the Duke's seal and 2 witness signatures, and a folded letter in the Duke's hand on plain paper. Vexley, the Earl said. He had gone the colour of cold milk. He was looking at the brown ink papers. Vexley, where did you— The 3 brown papers are the original 1785 notes. I bought them on Tuesday last from the Marquis of Renshaw's London solicitor for £14,240. They are yours. The white paper underneath is my deed releasing you from any obligation arising to me out of the purchase. It is witnessed by my own steward and by my solicitor. It is in your hand from this minute. The plain letter on the top is a personal note from me to you. The plain letter is private. Read whichever order you like. Take the time you require. The Earl held off lifting the papers. He set his right hand flat on the cherrywood beside them, and the Duke watched the colour come back into his face in 3 slow stages. The Earl picked up the 3 brown 1785 notes first, and unfolded them, and his hand began to shake. He set them down, and picked up the white deed of release, and read it, line by line. At the end, he set it down also, and put his face in his hands for a count of perhaps 15. The Duke sat on the footstool at his feet, and did not move, and did not speak. After the count of 15, the Earl lifted his face, and his eyes were wet, but he was not weeping, and he said evenly, I cannot accept this, Vexley. You can. You will. It is done. The Marquis cannot recover the notes. They are not his anymore. The deed of release means I cannot recover them from you. You have, this minute, no debt, anywhere, to anyone. The matter is closed.
Read the personal letter. The Earl picked up the plain letter. He read it. He read it again. He folded it carefully and laid it on top of the deed of release. He looked at the Duke. He said, "Vexley, you wish to ask Cordelia for her hand?" "Yes." "You did not have to buy £14,000 of my father's debt to ask Cordelia for her hand." "No, but I had to buy £14,000 of your father's debt to permit her to refuse me without consequence. The two are different transactions." "You wish her to be able to refuse you?" "I wish her to be able to do whatever she wishes. I should prefer she did not refuse me, but I shall not have her unfree to do so. Marbury, you cannot give me to her. I'm not asking it of you. I'm asking that the matter of Lord Felix be ended, by your hand and not mine, and that you then ask her, alone, at noon, to come into your library and consider whether she wishes also to see me, this afternoon at 3, on a separate matter. If she does not, I shall ride home. If she does, I shall come back at 3. Vexley, read the personal letter again. Marbury. Then sit with it for an hour. Then ring for your solicitor and dictate exactly what you wish communicated to Lord Felix. My coachman will carry your dictation to Renshaw this afternoon. Lord Felix will not be at Marbury today. There will be no scene. The matter will close cleanly. Your daughter will come into your library at noon, and you will explain what has happened, and she will then choose what she wishes to do at 3. I shall be at home until 2. Send word by the undergardener if she wishes to see me at 3, or wishes the gig sent back to Vexley empty. Either is the truth, and I shall ride it cheerfully." He stopped. He sat. The Earl looked at him for a long count of perhaps 20. The Earl named him. He answered. Had Vexley been thinking about his daughter for 17 years? The Earl asked. "Nearer 12, sir," the Duke said. 12. The Duke explained. He had noticed her at 15. He had corrected himself rigorously at 16, on the grounds that she was 12 and he was 18. He had not allowed himself to think about her again in that capacity until she was 19, and he had, on the whole, done the matter as honourably as the matter could be done. Edward knew, the Earl said. Edward had suspected, the Duke said. Edward had written him on his last night at Calais to say that he had suspected for 2 years, that he should have asked at Easter rather than at Calais, and that he was glad on his own account, which had cost him no small effort to write. 12 years, the Earl said. Yes, sir. And he had said nothing. He had had nothing she could have wanted that he could have offered, the Duke said. He was offering it now, because she required it now. The Earl looked at the 3 brown 1785 notes. He looked at the white deed of release. He looked at the plain, personal letter. He looked, last, at the Duke of Vexley, sitting on the footstool at his feet, in a riding coat darkening at the shoulders from the wet morning. He nodded once. He nodded again. He said, "Ring for Pemberton, Vexley. The solicitor's letter will not take 20 minutes to dictate. And after that, I should like to sit with my daughter for an hour, before any other gentleman in the county has occasion to come into my library." "Yes, sir." "And Vexley," the Earl said. "Yes, sir." He was not, after all, asking the Earl to give her to him. "No, sir," the Duke said. He was asking the Earl to ask her whether she wished to receive him at 3. That, the Earl observed, was an unusual posture regarding a marriage. It was, the Duke said, the posture from which he should wish a daughter of his own to be asked. He had only the one model of how to do these things, and the model was what he should wish for his own. The Earl was, for a long moment, quiet. He said at last, "Pemberton." "Sir." "His Grace will take the grey gelding home now. The undergardener will carry word to Vexley by 2:30 with my daughter's reply. Until then, you will tell the house that the Duke of Vexley called this morning to bring me a private matter respecting the chapel window at Vexley, which is true, and which is all that anyone else is to be told until I have spoken to my daughter." "Yes, sir." "That is all, Vexley." The Duke rose, took the saddlebag, and bowed once to the Earl. Pemberton handed him his gloves and hat at the front door, and he mounted in the rain and rode out of the front gate at a measured pace. On the front step, Pemberton allowed himself the small private indulgence of a closed-mouthed smile before he turned and went back into the house and up the great staircase to the morning room to tell Mrs. Bell, in the careful, neutral tone of a butler who knows exactly which sentence will be doing exactly which work, that the Earl wished to see Lady Cordelia in the library at 12. While the Earl was sealing the letter to the Marquis of Renshaw's solicitor, Lord Felix Ashbourne was in the long, high south drawing-room of the Renshaw house, and Lord Felix was alone, and the south drawing-room was empty of any other person, and Lord Felix did not know he was about to be observed, and he did not know that he had, against his own habit, allowed his face to fall into the precise shape it took when he was alone. Through the open door of the south drawing-room, open because Lord Felix's valet had been in and out twice already that morning, fetching a fresh handkerchief and a fresh stock and a fresh pin, a young housemaid called Sarah, who had been at the Renshaw house 6 weeks, was crossing the upper corridor with a brass coal scuttle in her hand on her way to the back stairs. Sarah glanced through the open door as she passed. She had been told by the housekeeper that Lord Felix did not like to be looked at, and that she should pass that door always with her eyes on the floor, and her eyes had been on the floor. Sarah was the kind of girl who did exactly what she was told. But her eyes had lifted at the last second, because she had heard a small sound from inside the south drawing-room, a sound she could not, at the time, have named. What she saw she did not understand, and would not afterwards repeat to anyone for 40 years. What she saw was Lord Felix Ashbourne standing at the long mantel of the south drawing-room with his back to the door, and on the mantel in front of him, a small framed miniature in tortoiseshell, a young woman of perhaps 17, her hair done in the fashion of 20 years before. Lord Felix's hand was on the miniature, his thumb moving slowly across the painted face, the way a thumb moves over a worry stone, his head bent over it, his shoulders in a small, soft posture they did not have anywhere else in the world. His whole, long, elegant, ice-blue-eyed self was, for the unwatched count of a slow breath, the shape of a man who had loved one person once, and was, at 28, no longer capable of doing it again. Sarah's foot made no sound on the corridor floor. She passed the open door, did not look again, carried the coal scuttle down the back stairs, and emptied it into the bin in the yard, as she did 6 times a day. And Lord Felix set the miniature back exactly where it had been on the mantel, straightened his shoulders, straightened his face, and walked to the window. By the time his valet came back with the fresh pin, his face was the face he wore in public, and the small, soft posture of his shoulders had been put away in whatever cold, inside place he kept such things. That was the antagonist, in the moment in his life when he most resembled a man. At Marbury, at 12, the Earl met Cordelia in the library. He sat in the wing chair he had not, this morning, been able to leave. She crossed to him in the soft grey light through the 3 southwest windows, and she stood in front of him without speaking. And he held up the 3 brown 1785 notes, and he held up the white deed of release, and he held up the personal letter, and he said, "The Duke of Vexley was here this morning at 10. He has bought your grandfather's notes. He has released me from any obligation. I have written, in my own hand and with Mr. Henderson, my solicitor present, to Lord Felix Ashbourne, the letter ending the engagement on the explicit grounds that the Marbury estate is, this day, no longer indebted to the Marquis of Renshaw, and that the consideration of the engagement is therefore at an end. The letter went to Berkeley Square by His Grace's own coachman at 10:30. There will be no public sale of Marbury. There will be no sale of any kind. There is no debt and no leverage and no compulsion. You are free of Lord Felix. The Duke has asked, separately and on his own account, whether you would be willing to receive him here at 3 this afternoon on a matter unconnected to the notes. He has asked for nothing else. He has asked me to ask you. The notes go to you and to me whether or not you receive him. He will, if you do not wish to receive him, ride no further into our lives. That is the morning. Cordelia, who had not slept the night and had practiced a dozen postures for this conversation, employed none of them. She sat down on the footstool at her father's feet, where the Duke had been sitting an hour and 40 minutes earlier, took the 3 brown 1785 notes from his hand and set them on the cherrywood table, took the white deed and read it, set it down also, and took the personal letter without unfolding it. "Papa, the personal letter." "It is to me." "May I read it?" "He left it with me on the understanding that it was private to me. But it would be. It is. It concerns you. Yes." She unfolded it. 3 short paragraphs in the Duke's clear, plain hand. The first thanked her father, briefly and formally, for his time. The second said the writer had been thinking for some 12 years of his possible suit for the Earl's daughter, that he had not made it because he had at no point had anything to offer her that her own house could not provide better, that the present circumstances had altered the balance, and that he would call at 3 to make the suit in person, if, and only if, her father and she both wished him to come. The third was a single line. "She is not, sir, ever, to be put in a position of being asked to choose me as a way out of a corner. The corner has been removed. The choice is hers." Cordelia folded the letter carefully and set it on the cherrywood table beside the notes and the deed. She set her hand on her father's knee. For 1 full minute she held her silence. The long case clock in the entrance hall struck 12:30. "Papa," she said. "Yes?" He would send word to His Grace to come at 3. He would sit with her in this library from 2:45. When His Grace came in, he would give the Duke her hand and would sit in the wing chair by the fire, and he would not speak, and would not nod, and would not encourage. He would let His Grace say what he had come to say. He would let her answer. She would answer as she thought fit. He did not, this day, get to give her to anyone. He said no. He might find the afternoon difficult. He said he should manage it. "Good," she said. She rose from the footstool. She kissed him on the forehead the way she had on Tuesday. She crossed the carpet to the door. She turned at the door. "Papa." "Yes." "In the matter of the brown notes." "Yes." "They are not to be burnt. They are to be put in the strong box in the muniment room. There may come a day when a grandson of mine, or of yours, will need to know exactly what the Marquis of Renshaw did to this house, and exactly what the Duke of Vexley did about it. And the documentary record is to survive into that grandson's hand. Do you take my meaning, Papa?" "I take your meaning." "Thank you." She went up to her room and shut the door. She crossed to the writing table, took the brass key on the black cord from the drawer, and laid it beside the unfinished horse-trotting sketch she had been pretending to work on for a fortnight. She took up the pencil, and she finished the horse. The curve of the trotting near foreleg, the tilt of the head, in the long, slow, even strokes of a woman whose hand was, for the first time in 11 weeks, entirely steady. At 3, the Duke arrived at the front of Marbury Hall in dry clothes, on the grey gelding, and Pemberton opened the door. He was shown into the library. The Earl was in the wing chair by the fire. Cordelia was at the centre window, in the indigo carriage dress she had worn to the chapel on Thursday, because she had decided that the chapel dress was the right dress for the afternoon's particular business. She turned, crossed to the Duke, and gave him her hand. He bowed over it. The Earl, who had been instructed at 12 precisely what was permitted of him and what was not, sat with his hands folded in his lap in the perfect, impassive posture of a man ordered by his daughter to be furniture for the next quarter of an hour, and doing his duty with great precision. "Your Grace," Lady Cordelia, "you have asked, through my father, whether you might call at 3 on a matter unconnected to the notes." "Yes." "I have received you. I have received you in this library, and not in the green drawing-room, because the green drawing-room is my mother's, and I wished, for this conversation, to be in my father's room, and not in my mother's." I tell you that so that you understand the choice of room is doing some of the speaking, my lord. I understand. Then you may now make whatever request you came to make. He held off making it.
He looked at her in the indigo carriage dress with the topaz on her middle finger and the brass key just barely visible at the open neck of her dress, where she had left it on purpose. And his face did the small, almost smile she had seen in the chapel. And he said simply, "Lady Cordelia, I should be honored if you would consent to be my wife. The settlements I described on Thursday stand exactly as I described them. The home farm goes to your father at a peppercorn rent regardless of your answer, because I had it drawn up on Monday before I knew what your answer was likely to be. The grey gelding is also yours from this minute, regardless of your answer, since I've been told by Mrs. Bell, by way of Mrs. Quill, that he is the only horse in this county on whom you have looked, in the last 5 years, with positive favour. The substantive question is the one I have just asked. I shall attempt no further persuasion. The case for me is what you know of me. The case against me is what you know of me. The answer is yours." She held her answer. She looked at him. She looked at her father by the fire. She looked at the slate-grey rain on the windows. She looked at the small fire in the grate, lit at 2:30 by Pemberton, in the useful gesture of a butler who knew a wet May afternoon wanted something to crackle in the corner for an important conversation. And she said at last, "Your Grace, I have a question to put to you before I answer." "Of course." "My horse-trotting sketch." He looked at her. For one count he failed to understand. Then his face changed. Fractionally, the way the light changes in a chapel when a cloud goes over. And he said, carefully, "Lady Cordelia, I am not, I think, sufficiently informed about your sketches to give you a useful answer." "My horse-trotting sketch. I have been working on it for a fortnight. I finished it at noon today. I should like to know, Your Grace, whether you have, in the last fortnight, looked at any of my correspondence." "I have not." "Not at any letter I have sent to your housekeeper? Not at any of my notes to my own aunt? Not at the drawing on my writing table at midnight by means of any creature in my own house?" "No." "You are very sure?" "I am very sure. I do not, in any circumstance, read other people's letters. I do not, in any circumstance, employ a soul in any house to look at another soul's drawings. Mrs. Bell speaks freely to Mrs. Quill of large public matters, but is not the same thing as my opening your writing table drawer at midnight by the agency of a third party. I have, in 12 years, never done such a thing, and shall not in any year of any future." "Good. I had to ask, my lord. I have, in the last 11 weeks, been the subject of considerable manoeuvring without my knowledge, and I have made myself a private contract to ask, of any person who proposes to come close to me henceforth, whether they have read any letters of mine in any manner whatsoever." "It is a contract you should keep with everyone, Lady Cordelia. I think it does you credit." "Thank you. You are welcome. Now, Your Grace." "Yes." "In the matter of your offer of marriage." "Yes." "I shall give you my answer in 3 weeks." "Yes." For one count, he held his eyes on her without blinking. He stood at the center of the library in the slate light, with his hat still in his hand, and he looked at her with the calm, grave grey of his eyes, and a small private smile beginning at the corner of his mouth. And he said, with the small humour of a man who has been ridden over 7 miles in the rain twice in a week, that 3 weeks, Lady Cordelia, was a precise period. It was precise on purpose, she said. He had had 37 days. She had had 3. She should like to have 21. At the end of the 21, she would give him her answer, one way or the other, in this library, at 3 on a Saturday. He might call no oftener than once a week. He might bring no further documents. He might make no settlement of any kind in the interim, because she wished the matter not to become indebting in any direction. Was that acceptable? Eminently, he said. Might he, in the 21 days,
ride the grey gelding occasionally? He might, he said. The horse was hers. The horse was not, she said. He had told her in the chapel she might refuse him, and the horse was hers only if she accepted. The horse was his from this minute, she told him. He had always been. The Duke had only loaned him to her until today, because the Duke of Vexley did not, even regarding his own horse, employ the smallest possible leverage. She had not, at the moment of his saying it in the chapel, appreciated the elegance of the structure. She appreciated it now. The grey gelding would remain in his stable. She would ride him on Tuesdays. He would be at home on Tuesdays. Good, she said. Lady Cordelia. Yes. You will forgive me one small additional remark. Yes. It was not, in fact, 12 years. My lord. You were a quick reader at 13. I noticed at 14. I corrected myself at 15, on the grounds that you were 11 and I was 16, which struck me even at 16 as a 5-year gap I had no business closing. I told the Earl this morning 12 years for the sake of the Earl's composure. The correct number is 15 years. I should not, regarding my own truthfulness, wish you to begin a 21-day period with even that small misstatement on the record. 15 years. Yes. For one count she held her silence. The fire crackled. The rain came down on the southwest windows. Her father, in the wing chair by the fire, did not move, although his eyes, in the moment, were doing something rather complicated that the Duke of Vexley, who was looking only at Cordelia, did not see. Your Grace, you may go home now. Yes, Lady Cordelia. You will come to dinner here on Tuesday? Yes, Lady Cordelia. You will, on Tuesday after dinner, ride the grey gelding home in whatever weather offers. The road from here to Vexley is 7 miles. You will, by the 7 miles, have time to consider whether you wish to come back on the following Tuesday or not. I shall come back on the following Tuesday. You may. We shall see. Lady Cordelia. Your Grace. He bowed and went out. Pemberton handed him his gloves at the front door. He rode out at the same measured walking pace as in the morning, but the colour of his face at the gate was not the same. Mr. Banbury, who had been told by Mrs. Bell at 1 o'clock to be at the lodge gate from 2:45, lifted his pipe to the Duke and said pleasantly, Good afternoon, Your Grace. Rain seems to be slackening. Good afternoon, Banbury. So it does. The home farm at Vexley is to be transferred to your Earl on Monday at a peppercorn rent. You will find me, after Monday, in considerable need of a competent steward to run it for him. We shall speak again in the autumn. With pleasure, Your Grace. Good day. Good day, Your Grace. The grey gelding went on at the measured walking pace of a horse in no particular hurry. Mr. Banbury watched until the Duke was out of sight, then went back into the lodge and put the kettle on. At exactly that minute, Mrs. Bell, in the morning room at Marbury, told Pemberton, with the small particular precision of a woman who had been waiting 12 years for permission to use this sentence, that her ladyship would take her tea in her own room. The 3 Tuesdays in May went past at the measured walking pace of a horse in no hurry. The Duke came to dinner on each of them on the grey gelding. He spoke to the Earl about timber, to Mrs. Bell about a chocolate and pear pudding she had not made since 1817, and to Cordelia, across the table, about the 4-pound trout of August 1815, and the Coke and the Lincoln's Inn pamphlet she had been reading at midnight by the kitchen fire on Edward's recommendation when she was 19. On the 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd of June, the weather warm and the Vexley wisteria having shed its violet drift, he stayed after dinner in the library and showed no sign, by 9:30, of riding home. The Earl, instructed by Mrs. Bell at 6 that he was on no account to leave the library before 9:45, pretended to read the same page of the Coke twice over, while Cordelia, at the window, said quietly to the Duke, Your Grace, the rose garden has opened its first dozen blooms. The light will hold until 9. Would you care to? Yes. They went out by the south door. The rose garden lay below the south terrace in 3 sunken parterres, and the air smelled of warm stone and bruised petal and the sharp astringency of box hedge. A thrush in the elm at the far corner was running through its evening song. They walked the first parterre side by side without speaking, and at the far end the Duke stopped beside a deep crimson bloom on a low standard rose. Tomorrow, he said quietly, was the third Saturday. It was. 3 weeks ago this minute, he said. They had been in this house at 3 in the afternoon, and she had said she would give him her answer in 21 days. Yes. It was not yet 3 in the afternoon tomorrow, he said. He would not ask her for the answer this evening. She had not, my lord, expected him to. But it was, if she did not object, the appropriate evening for him to tell her the small additional thing he should have told her in the library on that Saturday, and had held back, because he had thought 21 days might be too short a period to bear the additional weight of it. Yes. He turned the deep crimson bloom toward himself by the stem with one gloved finger, and the warm evening light caught the inside of it and made it the color of garnet. And he said, Lady Cordelia, I told you in the chapel that the notes were a means and the proposal a separate matter. That is true. I told the Earl on Saturday morning that I had been thinking of you for 12 years, and I corrected myself to 15 later in the same day. That is also true. What I did not say in either room is the thing that has, in the matter, been the difficulty. I have, for 15 years, regarded you as the woman I should have liked to ask, in any year of those 15, to be my wife, had any year offered the right circumstance. The circumstance never offered. I therefore held my tongue. I have not, in those 15 years, courted any other woman, on the straightforward grounds that I was not free to court her, because I had already, in private, settled the question of where my heart was housed. The settlement was on my side only. It bound me. It did not bind you. It was not, until this morning of the third Saturday, the kind of settlement I had any right to communicate to you. I am communicating it tonight because, whatever your answer tomorrow, I should wish you to know that 15 years of silence have not been the silence of indifference. They have been the silence of a man who would not, until the right minute, open his mouth. The right minute, I had concluded, was the minute when you could refuse me without losing anything by the refusal. That minute arrived, by my best calculation, on Saturday morning last in your father's library at 10. I am being slightly less quiet now. For one count, she held her silence. The thrush in the elm went on. She turned to him. She set her gloved hand lightly on the front of his waistcoat, over the place where she could feel, very faintly, his heart. He looked down at her hand. He did not move. He waited for her to lift it again, in the small discipline of a man who had decided 15 years ago that he would not, until invited, lay a finger on her without her permission, and was not intending to break that discipline at 20 minutes to 9. My lord, she said. Yes. He would sleep at Vexley tonight, in the dignity of a man who did not yet know what tomorrow at 3 would bring. He would not, between now and 3 tomorrow, ride back to this house. He would send no further communication of any kind. To each of these he answered yes, no, no. Good, she said. She lifted her hand off his waistcoat. They walked back toward the south terrace at the same measured pace, and at the foot of the terrace steps she stopped and turned to him again. And she said, with the small, private humor of a woman who had been doing considerable internal work, Your Grace, one small thing. Yes. You said in the library 3 weeks ago that the grey gelding had been mine from the moment of your saying so. Yes. I have ridden him on 3 Tuesdays. He has, on each of the 3 Tuesdays, behaved as if I were his preferred rider, which is intelligence I cannot have communicated to him by means of any speech he speaks. I rode him to Marbury and back on each of the Tuesdays. He associates Marbury with you, and the road home with no one of particular interest. He has worked out the simple arithmetic for himself. He is, in that case, a better mathematician than the Marquis of Renshaw. He was, Lady Cordelia, in many particulars, the most reliable creature of his acquaintance. Good, she said. The horse might continue, then, in his current opinions. They went up the terrace steps together. Mrs. Bell, in the morning room window above the terrace, watched them come in and did not move from the window for a count of 5 before she turned and went down the back stairs to find Pemberton and to instruct him, in the careful, neutral tone of a 60-year-old woman who knew exactly which sentence would be doing exactly which work, that the rose cuttings in the south parterre would, tomorrow morning at 7, need very particular attention from the undergardener. Saturday morning came in hot and bright with no wind, the meadows blue with cornflower, and the house at Marbury was in the particular hush of a place in which a thing of importance is going to happen at 3. At 9:20, the undergardener came up the back stairs to the morning room with the folded note from the lodge. Mrs. Bell broke the seal and read it once and set it down with the small, still expression of a woman who has just been informed that the weather, which had been promising fair until breakfast, was about to break. "My lady," she said quietly. "Mrs. Bell." "A note from the lodge. The undergardener brought it. It is from Lord Felix Ashbourne." Cordelia, at the writing table, did not turn. She set down her pencil carefully. She heard her own pulse in her left ear. "Read it to me, Mrs. Bell." Mrs. Bell read it. The note was 3 lines in Lord Felix's elegant, unhurried hand. It informed Lady Cordelia that he had taken the 4 o'clock mail coach from London on Friday, having read on Thursday evening a letter from her father containing assertions about the cessation of certain debts that he wished to verify in person. That he was breakfasting at the Boar's Head Inn, 4 miles from the gates of Marbury Hall, and that he proposed, in the course of the morning, to walk up to Marbury to pay his respects to the Earl and to herself, since the matter of the engagement was, in his view, one whose dissolution had been effected through irregular and undocumented transactions, which it was the right of the prospective groom to examine on the original papers before any final cessation could be regarded as having occurred. He should, he wrote, be at Marbury by 11. Mrs. Bell set the note down. Cordelia sat for a full minute without moving. The pencil in her hand was still. At the end of the minute, she set it down, stood up, crossed to the bell pull, and rang it once. Pemberton came up at his unhurried walking pace, and she said evenly, "Pemberton, Lord Felix Ashbourne will be at the front door at 11. You will admit him. You will show him into the green drawing-room. You will tell him that the Earl my father is at present indisposed, but will receive him at 12. You will then have one of the undergrooms go down to Vexley with a verbal message to Mrs. Quill. The verbal message is, His Grace is to be informed that Lord Felix has come, that the Earl will receive him at 12 in the library, that there will not, on this occasion, be any need for His Grace to come over. His Grace is to remain at Vexley. He is to do no riding. He is to send no answer. The matter at Marbury is to be handled by the Marbury household. That is the verbal message. The undergroom is to deliver it to Mrs. Quill, and not to His Grace personally. You are to convey the same to the undergroom in your own words. Is that clear, Pemberton?" "It was, my lady." She thanked him. He bowed and went out. Mrs. Bell sat down slowly in the chair beside the morning-room fire. For one count, she held her silence. Then she said, quietly, "My lady, His Grace will not, when he learns of this, be pleased that the message was sent at all. He will not be pleased. He will, in the end, agree with me. The matter this morning is mine to close. The Duke arranged that the engagement could be ended without scandal. The engagement has been ended. Lord Felix is not coming today to recover it. He is coming to humiliate the man who ended it. And the most effective place would be in this house, with the Duke standing beside him. Because the Duke is the visible reason the engagement was endable. And Lord Felix will, given the opportunity, address every word at the Duke, and not at my father or at me. The Duke is therefore not to be in the library at 12. He is to be at Vexley. Lord Felix is to address his words at me, in my father's presence, with no Duke to perform them for. He will, in those circumstances, run out of words remarkably quickly. Because Lord Felix is a man who speaks well only when he speaks at someone whose presence he resents. He cannot speak well at a woman in a room. He has demonstrated as much in his own curricle. He will demonstrate it again in my father's library at 12. Mrs. Bell. My lady. Will you sit in the library at 12, behind my father's wing chair, with the door slightly open onto the corridor, so that any servant of this house who needs to come in for any reason whatever may do so without the appearance of intrusion? I will, my lady. Thank you. The dress at 12 is the indigo carriage dress and the topaz. The brass key stays on the cord under the dress. The hair is up. Tell Annie. Yes, my lady. And Mrs. Bell. My lady. After the matter at 12 has been concluded, I shall go to my room for 1 hour. I shall, between 1 and 2, lie down on my bed with the curtains drawn and not speak to anyone. At 2, I shall come down, and at 3, His Grace will arrive, and at 3 I shall give him my answer. Do you understand the order of the morning? I do, my lady. Good. She sat at the writing table with the pencil in her hand and went through, slowly, the order of the sentences she intended to use in her father's library at 12. At 11:15, Annie put up her hair, and at 11 precisely, Pemberton opened the front door to Lord Felix. She had known from the minute Mrs. Bell read the note what she was being asked to walk through. He had not come to recover the engagement. He had come to make its ending hurt. He would compliment her gown, her hair. He would, in front of her father, deliver in his pleasant social manner a series of small, precise observations about her person, her family, her father's solvency, her late brother, her midnight pamphlet reading, her grandfather's Brighton card room of 1785, and the Duke's 12 years of quiet premeditation. He had come to make sure she remembered, on every Tuesday evening for the rest of her life, that she had been bought out of his hand by a neighbour. He had come to teach her that she had been a transaction from the first, and would be one in the last. He had read her father's letter on Thursday evening, poured a brandy and emptied it, and sat in the south drawing-room in front of the tortoiseshell miniature, and made himself a private contract. The lady who had refused him would, on Saturday morning at 12, sit in her father's library and listen to him speak for half an hour without once raising her voice. That was the cost the lady would pay for the refusal. He had bought her up exactly as his father had bought up her grandfather's notes, and the buying up had failed, and the failure was being paid for in this morning's coach, and this morning's particular cold calm in his blue eyes. Cordelia walked down the great staircase at 5 minutes to 12, and felt the cold of the topaz on her finger and the brass key under the indigo dress. She walked into the library, sat in the second wing chair opposite her father, folded her hands, and waited. At 12 precisely, Pemberton opened the door and announced, with clean neutrality, "Lord Felix Ashbourne, my lord." Lord Felix came in. He bowed to the Earl, to Cordelia. Neither rose. He stood at the centre of the carpet and arranged the line of his coat, the cold, pleasant smile he had brought from Berkeley Square sitting on his face exactly as practised in the mirror at the Boar's Head, and he said, in his pleasant, unhurried voice, "Lady Cordelia, Marbury, you will forgive my impertinence in coming down without warning. I had, after reflection on the very interesting letter I received from Marbury on Thursday evening, a private wish to see, in person and on the original papers, the documentation by which a certain financial obligation between this house and the Renshaw house is said, this week, to have been discharged. The matter of the engagement is, I will admit, a separate question, but the matter of the discharge is the one upon which I should like the courtesy of the original papers." "Lord Felix," Cordelia said. "Lady Cordelia, you shall not, in this house this morning, see the original papers. You will forgive me. I shall not forgive you anything until I have finished. You will, in this room, this morning, sit down in the chair by the door, and you will permit me to speak without interruption for 10 minutes by the long case clock, after which time I shall give you 10 minutes to reply on any subject of your choosing, after which time you will leave this house. Pemberton, who is at present in the corridor outside this library, will show you to the front door at 20 minutes past 12. The mail coach back to London passes the Boar's Head at 2:30. You will, with patient walking, make it. You will not, in the meantime, be offered refreshment in this house, because to offer you refreshment would be to invite you to remain, and I do not, in any quarter of the next 20 minutes, invite you to remain anywhere except in the chair by the door. Will you sit?
Lord Felix. He held back from sitting. He looked at her with the small adjustment of a hawk on a hare. The cold, pleasant smile did not change, but underneath the smile, a fast calculation went through him. A man who had expected the upper hand of a quiet morning's discussion, and had been informed in the first 30 seconds that the upper hand was not, in any room of this house, his.
Lady Cordelia, you will permit me to observe that you are speaking somewhat warmly.
I am not warm. I am calm. I have for 11 weeks been calm with you, my lord. I have been calm in your curricle, in my mother's green drawing room, and when you informed me how a tiara I was not to own was to be stored. I shall be calm in the presence of your displeasure this morning also. The calmness is not a sign that anything you say will land. It is a sign that you misread, in the particular way men of your education misread, the kind of woman my father brought me up to be. I am not that kind. Through 11 weeks, you took no opportunity to find it out. Sit down in the chair by the door. He sat. He did not sit easily. The cold, pleasant smile slipped half an inch off his face in the 4 feet between the center of the library and the chair by the door, and did not entirely climb back on. Cordelia spoke for 10 minutes by the long case clock. She did not raise her voice. In every sentence, her eyes rested only on his face. She told him, in sequence, the following. The financial obligation between Marbury and Renshaw was no longer his concern, no longer his father's, no longer the concern of any solicitor in London. It was therefore not a subject on which her father owed him the courtesy of any documentation whatever. The engagement, having been entered into solely as a function of that obligation, was, in the legal and moral view of every adult in the county, ended by the ending of it. Any further attempt to assert any continuing claim on her person, her name, or her household would be regarded as harassment and not as suitorship. She was, in her own person, no longer Lord Felix Ashbourne's prospective wife, and would not be, in any year of any future, his prospective anything. She was, in addition, no longer required to listen to any unsolicited assessment of her looks, her conduct, her colouring, her family, her grandfather, her brother, her stewards, or the warmth of her acknowledgement of any servant of any house in this county. This private cessation took effect, by her own announcement of it, from the present moment forward. He would, in the 4 minutes remaining of his 10, sit silent in the chair by the door. At the end of those 4 minutes, he would have his own 10 minutes in which to reply, and those 10 minutes were the entirety of what she or her father owed him, in this room or in any other room of this house, ever again, on any subject. She finished. She did not look away from his face. The long case clock struck 12:15. "You have 10 minutes, Lord Felix," she said. He held them in reserve. He looked at her with the cold blue of his eyes carefully composed. He looked at the Earl, who had not once looked at him. He looked at the slightly open door, beyond which Mrs. Bell's grey skirt was visible against the wainscot. He looked last at the brass key, which had worked itself half free of the neckline of the indigo dress, and was lying now on the white skin of her throat in the soft June light. And the small, reflexive thing that went across his face, in the count of half a second, was not, in his case, a soft thing. "Lady Cordelia, Marbury, I shall be very brief." "Take your full 10 minutes if you require them, my lord." "I do not require them. I shall give you the courtesy of brevity. I came down this morning under the impression that the matter was not yet settled. I have, in the last quarter of an hour, been disabused of it. I shall not trouble this house again.
I should wish you to convey to His Grace the Duke of Vexley, however, that the method by which His Grace has secured the lady is a method I have observed with attention. I do not regard myself as the loser of any transaction. I regard myself as the man who has, by his own conduct, taught a duke that a duke's full attention was, at last, required. The duke, in 12 years, had not given that attention. He gave it in £14,000 of paper in a Lincoln's Inn solicitor's office on a Tuesday. He gave it because I came down to Marbury on a Saturday in his absence and drove the lady at 4 miles an hour in my own curricle. I am, regarding £14,000, the inadvertent and unpaid steward of His Grace's awakening. He should, in due course, send me his thanks. I shall, in the meanwhile, withdraw. Marbury. Lady Cordelia. Pemberton, my hat. He stood. He bowed. Pemberton opened the library door fully. Lord Felix walked out into the corridor, and down the corridor, and across the entrance hall, and Pemberton handed him his hat at the front door. Lord Felix Ashbourne walked down the front steps of Marbury Hall at the same pace at which he had walked up them, and through the 4 miles of road between the front gate of Marbury and the door of the Boar's Head. He never once looked back over his shoulder. What nobody at Marbury saw, but what Sarah the housemaid would observe 4 nights later through a doorway opened by mistake, was this. Lord Felix walked into the south drawing-room of the Renshaw house on the Wednesday evening, with his cold, pleasant face, and stood at the long mantel in front of the tortoise-shell miniature. This time, his thumb stayed still. He set his palm flat across the whole of the small painting, and stood with his hand covering it for nearly a minute. Then he took his hand away, turned the miniature face down on the mantel, and went out. Sarah held what she had seen close for 40 years without repeating it to any person. The antagonist had made his exit with dignity and tact, and the small parting blow he had practiced in the mirror. He had gone home and, in the privacy of his own house, covered the small painted face, which was the one face in the world he had ever properly loved. That was the whole of what was permitted to him, because he was not, in this story, a man who would be redeemed in any third beat. He had not the capacity. The book closed on him at the mantel with his palm flat over the painted face. At Marbury, at 12:20, Cordelia sat in the wing chair opposite her father for a count of perhaps 30. Her father kept his silence through it. She rose, crossed to him, knelt at the wing chair, and set her cheek for a beat against the back of his hand. Then she went up to her room, drew the curtains, and lay down on the bed in the indigo carriage dress, and she slept, against her own expectation, for 1 hour and 20 minutes. At 2, Annie came in and woke her. She washed her face, had her tea, came down at 2:45. At 3, the Duke arrived at the front of Marbury Hall on the grey gelding. He had received the verbal message at 11, had sat in his library with the windows open to the wisteria, and read the same page of the Coke twice over, and at 2:30 he had saddled the grey gelding himself and ridden the 7 miles at his measured walking pace. He came into the library. The Earl sat with his hands folded in his lap in the same impassive posture as 3 weeks ago. Cordelia, at the centre window, turned at the sound of the door. "Your Grace." "Lady Cordelia." "You will sit, my lord. There is, regarding Lord Felix's call this morning, a small thing to clear before I answer the question you came to put to me." "Lady Cordelia, the morning is yours. I do not require to hear of it. I came at 3 to receive your answer to the question I put on the 2nd of June at 3 in the Rose Garden, and I shall, if you wish, receive it now without any account of the morning." "You shall receive an account of the morning. The morning is, in the matter, relevant. Sit, my lord." He sat in the smaller chair by the window. She did not sit. She stood at the centre window with her hands folded and the brass key visible at the open neck of the dress, and she spoke for perhaps 8 minutes. She told him exactly what Lord Felix had said in the library at 12, and exactly what she had replied. That Lord Felix had withdrawn at 12:20 and would not return. That the matter was, by her own conduct of the morning rather than by his, closed. She told him the verbal message at 11 had been hers and not Mrs. Bell's, that she had wished the matter to be conducted in Lord Felix's actual absence of any audience that might excuse his rhetoric and provide him a target, and that she had wished His Grace to remain at Vexley, not because His Grace had been thought unequal to the matter, but because the matter had been hers. At the finish, her eyes rested only on him.
Your Grace?
Yes, Lady Cordelia.
You may, if you wish, now make any small particular reproach you require to make about the morning's verbal message.
I do not wish to make any reproach.
You are not, in your own opinion, owed any explanation as to why I should have closed a matter in your visible absence.
No, the matter was yours, as you say. You closed it in the manner that closed it. I have, this minute, no reproach whatever, in this matter or in any other matter. If I had any small unease at 11 o'clock when the verbal message arrived, the unease was that I should have wished by reflex to be in the room. I am, I think, glad I was not. Lord Felix, in your presence in your father's library, with no third party to perform for, is the version of Lord Felix at his weakest, and the version of Cordelia Hartwell answering him alone in her father's library is the version of you at her strongest, and your strongest is what was wanted in the morning. I am, on consideration, content that the verbal message went. Good. Lady Cordelia.
Yes.
The question. She crossed the carpet to him. She stopped in front of his chair. She kept her hands folded in front of the indigo dress. The Earl, in the wing chair by the fire, had not moved.
Your Grace, the answer to the question you put to me on the 2nd of June at 3 in the Rose Garden, and which you came back here at 3 this afternoon to receive an answer to, is yes.
He held his answer. He sat in the smaller chair by the window in the soft afternoon light, and his face did the almost smile of the chapel 3 weeks ago, and the smile this time did not stop. He rose. He took her hand. He bent over it. He held it. Lady Cordelia, you will forgive me one moment in which I must not speak.
Yes.
He held her hand. He did not speak. The clock in the corner of the library was the only sound in the room. After the moment, he straightened. He turned, with her hand still in his, to the Earl in the wing chair by the fire, and he said, he turned with her hand still in his, and asked her father for his blessing. With his blessing, Vexley, the Earl said. Thank you, sir. The Earl said her name. She said, Papa. He was glad.
Yes, Papa.
The Earl rose from the wing chair for the first time in 5 months without being absolutely obliged to rise, and he crossed the carpet at his slow, careful walking pace, and he laid his hand on his daughter's shoulder and on the Duke's shoulder, and he said nothing for a count of 7. Then he turned and went out of the library and closed the door behind him, and he went to find Mrs. Bell, because there were arrangements to be set in motion that could not be set in motion in the room with them. The Duke stood at the centre of the library with Cordelia's hand in his. He looked down at it, at the topaz on the middle finger, at the small white scar across the back of the third knuckle where she had cut herself on a pheasant feather at 8, and he said quietly, Lady Cordelia, I shall, on Tuesday next, ride over with the small leather case from my mother's writing desk. There is in it a ring she would have liked you to wear if you cared for it. You may prefer one chosen entirely by yourself, in which case the trip to the goldsmith is yours to make at any moment between now and Christmas. I tell you the offer now so that you may sleep upon it before Tuesday.
Your Grace.
Yes.
I shall look at the ring in the small leather case on Tuesday. I shall, if I do not care for it, tell you so. If I do care for it, I shall wear it.
Yes.
Adrian.
He was slow to react to his own name. He had not, in the chapel, or in the library, or in the rose garden, used it to her. She had not, in 17 years, used it to him. He looked at her. The small, almost smile of the chapel did the larger thing it had been wishing for 15 years to do, and his grey eyes went, in the soft, warm afternoon light, the colour of summer river water, and he said, "Cordelia."
"Adrian."
"Yes."
"I shall, after this afternoon, expect you to use my name."
"I shall." He drew her gently by the held hand, the small remaining distance toward him. He laid his other hand, for the first time in 17 years, against the side of her face, the broad, warm width of the palm she had on Thursday at the chapel imagined, and then made herself stop imagining. And his thumb moved slowly across her cheekbone. She closed her eyes for a beat, and he bent his head to her. And the kiss, when it came, was the kiss of a man who had been waiting 15 years to be invited to give one, and was not going to be hurried. She opened her eyes against his cheek when it had finished, and she said evenly into the warm collar of his coat, "Adrian, we shall be married in the chapel at Vexley by the end of August. The 14th, I think. The chapel will hold 30. We shall have 30. My Aunt Lavinia, my father, your great-aunt, Mrs. Bell, Mrs. Quill, Pemberton, Mr. Banbury, the undergardener at Vexley, because the undergardener carried a message for us on the 12th of May, without which we should not now be having this conversation, and the remaining 22 for you to choose at your leisure. The new window of my brother will look down on us. Edward would approve. Edward, I think, will be present in the way the departed are present when the windows are right." "Yes."
"And Adrian."
"Yes."
"You will, in the rest of the afternoon, walk with me again in the rose garden. And you will, in the rose garden, tell me the names of the 4 roses in the south parterre that I have, in 25 years,
never asked the names of, because I've been told by Mr. Banbury that you, at 20, planted the 4 of them yourself one March when you had nothing else to do. They were called, he said, in order of planting: Eleanor, Margaret, Constance, and Cordelia.
"Adrian," she said.
"Yes, the 4th one. The 4th one I planted at 23. The 4th one is the deep crimson at the end of the first parterre. I planted it the year you turned 18. I had not, that year, told anyone its name. I am telling you its name this afternoon. You may, between now and August the 14th, decide what you wish to do about the information." The tears she might have shed in that minute stayed inside her. No words for that minute came to her tongue. She turned her face slightly against the palm of his hand, and she set her own hand over his on her face, and held it there, for a long, quiet count of 7. Out beyond the southwest windows, a thrush in the elm at the far corner of the rose garden was running through its afternoon song, and Mrs. Bell, in the morning room window above the terrace, had her hand pressed firmly over her own mouth, and was not going to be available to anyone for a quarter of an hour. Downstairs in the entrance hall, Pemberton allowed himself the second of his 2 closed-mouthed smiles of the spring, and he turned, and he went down the corridor toward the kitchen, because there was a fresh pot of tea to be sent up to the library, and a tray of warm seed cakes, and a small private letter to be written to Mrs. Quill at Vexley in his own hand. The works of a butler on the afternoon of the day when a duke and an earl's daughter had at last, after 17 years of a river between 2 estates, decided to belong on the same side of it for the remainder of their lives. By August the 14th, the chapel at Vexley had 30 in it. The new green and gold window of Edward caught the morning light at the angle the masons had calculated for August, and Cordelia walked the length of the chapel on her father's arm in a deep crimson silk gown, the colour of the 4th rose in the south parterre, because she had decided that she was not, on her wedding day, going to wear a white she had not chosen. Adrian, in a dark indigo coat at the altar, with his back straight and his hands at his sides, watched her come down the chapel over the cold flagstones with the small, grave grey of his eyes. He gave her his hand. The parson read the service. The answers were the right ones. At the end, Adrian put on her finger the slim gold band from the leather case, and on the middle finger of her right hand she still wore her mother's topaz, and at her throat, on the black cord, she still wore Edward's brass key. They walked out together into the wisteria-bright south door of the chapel, and the chestnuts at the far end of the avenue moved their leaves in the south wind. Mr. Banbury, at the chapel gate in the new dark suit Mrs. Bell had ordered for him from the Marbury tailor, lifted his hat to them as they came through. Adrian stopped and laid his hand on Mr. Banbury's shoulder and said quietly, "Banbury, the home farm at Vexley is yours to run from Monday. I shall expect to be informed by you when the matter requires informing, and let alone by you when it does not. We shall, I think, agree handsomely on which is which." Mr. Banbury smiled the same slow, careful smile he had smiled at the broom window in May, and they went on. That evening, at Vexley, the green drawing-room had been redone in the pale beech-leaf colour of her mother's at Marbury. Adrian had had the painters do it in July as a private surprise. On the marquetry table by the fire stood the green leather coke. Beside it, in a glass case from the Vexley joiner, lay the 3 brown 1785 notes, folded once together with the white deed of release. On the cherrywood writing table by the south window stood a small framed pencil sketch of a horse trotting on a road, which Cordelia had set there earlier in the day. The windows were open onto the rose garden. The deep crimson Cordelia at the end of the first parterre was in its second flowering, and a thrush in the elm at the far corner was running through its evening song with the same great repetition it had used in June. She was promised, in May, to a lord she did not love. The Duke, in the chapel of his own estate on the morning of Thursday the 12th of May, offered her a way out. And the way out had been, in his own careful telling, a piece of paper that happened to be worth £14,000, and a deed of release on plain paper in his own hand, and a request that she might consider, at 3 on a separate afternoon, whether she should care to receive him on a separate matter. She had received him on the separate matter. She had said yes. And on the warm August evening, at the open window of the green drawing-room at Vexley, with the brass key cool against her breastbone, and the slim band of his gold on her finger, and the deep crimson roses he had planted at 23, for an 18-year-old he had not expected to be permitted to marry, Cordelia, Duchess of Vexley, set her hand on her husband's warm linen sleeve, and said quietly into the August dusk, "Adrian, tell me again the name of the 4th rose." And he turned to her and said quietly, "Cordelia." And she smiled, and he smiled, and the thrush in the elm at the far corner went on with its evening song, and they stood together at the open window, and in the warm dusk there was nothing more they needed to say.